Good afternoon. I'd like to first of all thank the meeting organizers for asking me to be here today to tell you a little bit about a project entitled Treatment Approaches to Preeclampsia in Low Resource Settings. And this project has been an ongoing collaboration with colleagues in India at GMC Nagpur and CMC Vellore, and in the US, Gynuity Health Projects, and the University of Washington. So as we heard this morning, magnesium sulfate is of course the drug of choice for the prevention and treatment of eclampsia. However, there still remain significant barriers to its use in many settings. In order for women to receive appropriate care, facilities must be ready to receive them with the drugs and equipment necessary. Health centers must have systems in place for case management and referral, and providers and staff need to know what to do and when to do it. But equally important is provider confidence, and a few speakers have mentioned that so far today. We and others have done qualitative research that has shown that providers are often reluctant to provide magnesium sulfate, either because they're concerned about the safety and of the use of the drug or the monitoring required in its use. So again, as we heard earlier this morning and in other presentations, there are primarily two methods of administration of magnesium sulfate. The first, of course, intramuscular administration, requires very little equipment, and it can be performed by a wide range of providers in a community-based setting. However, one disadvantage to the IM administration is that it requires repeated multiple injections. And of course, if you're doing a full course of magnesium sulfate treatment over the course of 24 hours, this can be very painful for a woman. And in some cases, the pain associated with that may perhaps deter providers in providing a full course of treatment that's actually clinically necessary. The second mode of administration, of course, is intravenous administration. And as we know, IV administration of this course is less painful and more comfortable for women. But in many settings, it requires the use of an electric infusion pump, which of course is expensive, and requires a regular electric supply, which of course may not be available in many low resource settings. Manually infused drug, of course, is often used in the delivery of the IV loading dose. And we know in the delivery of that dose that the dosing can be erratic and in some cases can be associated with adverse side effects associated with magnesium sulfate. I think many of you in clinical settings, of course, know of what often happens when you have a new intern, for instance, and in a hurry to get the patient perhaps completed, they'll push the magnesium sulfate too quickly and then see what results in terms of adverse effects for women. So what we sought to design then is to kind of combine the advantages of IV administration in terms of the positive effects it had for women in terms of the delivery of the drug with a mode that would be easy for providers and would perhaps encourage them to use magnesium sulfate more. So to do this, we tested the use of the Springfusor, which is a spring-loaded pump, which you can see here in this photo. The pump works by virtue of a spring-loaded mechanism. The provider inserts a syringe attached to a set of flow control tubing into the pump, and then the pump then provides a constant source of pressure, and the drug delivery rate is actually determined by the diameter of the tubing that's attached to the end of the syringe. Now, the Springfusor pump is actually manufactured by a company in Australia, and it's been used for the administration of antibiotics and analgesics in outpatient settings. But this was the first time the pump had ever been used for the delivery of magnesium sulfate. And so a primary purpose of this project was actually to design a protocol for using the pump for delivery of magnesium sulfate. So this project then actually was constituted of a series of studies. The first study was a randomized trial where we compared the use of the Springfusor pump to an IV-IM regimen, which is, of course, the most commonly used regimen in most low-resource settings. In this study, which I've labeled Phase 1 here, the randomized trial was conducted in two tertiary-level facilities in India, CMC Vellore and GMC Nagpur. Following the conclusion of the randomized trial, we actually conducted an open-label trial in 2 secondary level facilities that were associated with GMC Nagpur. So in the randomized trial, women were randomized to one of 2 treatments. Group 1 received magnesium sulfate with the Springfusor using a drug regimen that consisted of a loading dose of 4 grams, followed by a maintenance dose of approximately 1 gram per hour. So we designed this protocol based on the Zuspan IV protocol. The syringe was changed at 4-hour intervals. So, in other words, the provider would gave the loading dose with one set of control tubing. At the completion of the loading dose, they changed the tubing with the attached syringe, and at the end of each maintenance dose interval, which was approximately 4 hours, they would reload the syringe and reattach the syringe. Women in the standard of care arm received treatment following the standard Pritchard regime, which was, again, the regimen that's used in these facilities. And in both arms, the maintenance therapy was administered as long as clinically necessary, but at least for 24 hours. In terms of our inclusion and inclusion criteria, we modeled this, the criteria on the MAGPIE trial, so we used the same criteria as had been used in MAGPIE, which I think most of you are familiar with. We elected to exclude, we had 2 exclusion criteria, and these exclusion criteria were not clinically based, they were more practical, because part of the purpose of the trial was to look at the acceptability of treatment with the Springfusor for women, and so we elected not to include women who were eclamptic or seizing at the time of enrollment, in part because we could not collect acceptability data from them. And we also excluded women who had received magnesium sulfate in the 24 hours prior to study enrollment. So this just quickly is the background characteristics, and it's just to demonstrate that our randomization was effective and there was no significant difference between the 2 study groups. Most women were approximately 24 years old and 34 weeks gestation, and about 80% had presented prior to delivery. Now looking at the study results, specifically the drug delivery rates, as I had mentioned, we used the existing Springfusor flow-controlled tubing. We didn't, as it was marketed currently, and this flow-controlled tubing is actually, as I mentioned, is not specifically designed for magnesium sulfate use. Rather, the tubing has been calibrated for use with saline. So we had to sort of adapt this tubing to our own purposes. And due to the viscosity of magnesium sulfate, we found that a Springfusor tubing that ran at approximately 25% of the calibrated rate of saline. So actually, it's just to say that if this were to be rolled out in any setting, there would be modifications that need to take place just based on the way that tubing is currently labeled versus the way we actually used it in the trial. That being said, looking at the drug delivery rates, what we found is that there was no statistically significant difference in drug delivery rates between the 2 study arms. And the Springfusor actually performed according to existing standards for IV delivery of magnesium sulfate. One of our primary outcomes of interest was to look at drug discontinuation rates. And this was because we hypothesized that women or providers would be more likely to stop treatment due to side effects or ill effects associated with IM dosing. And what we actually found is that the discontinuation rates were similar in the 2 arms, which was perhaps surprising, but we did find, and as you'll see in the next slide, that the reasons for discontinuation were slightly different between the 2 study arms. So in the case of the standard of care, more women stopped treatment due to either women's request, side effects, oliguria or renal failure. We actually did not have any cases of renal failure. This is just a compound category, or signs of toxicity. In most of these cases, it was associated with signs of toxicity. That's why they elected to stop the treatment. In the case of the Springfusor, what we had is we had more cases where the treatment was stopped due to staff error or provider preference. And in this case, almost all of these cases, 5 of the 7, were due to problems with IV insertion or IV maintenance. And in most of these cases, it was at night, in times in which the staff shifted and there was difficulties in maintaining the IV line. So then turning to look at the side effects that were associated with both of these delivery mechanisms, what you can see here is that women in the Springfusor arm had significantly fewer side effects than those women in the standard of care arm. And as you'll see in the next slide, this correlated with the acceptability of the 2 treatment regimens for women. Actually, before I get to the acceptability, first we'll take a brief look at maternal outcomes. As you can see, that our sample size was rather small, and it was not powered to look at differences in maternal death or severe morbidity. But what we can say is that it was similar between the both arms. The cesarean section rate was similar, and we had 2 cases where a woman ceased post-treatment, 1 in both study arms. In most cases, women recovered and were improving at the time of discharge. Now, looking at patient acceptability, as you can see, we did see a significant difference in women's acceptability of the 2 different delivery methods. Women in the Springfusor arm found the side effects and pain associated with the treatment more acceptable than women who were in the standard of care. Now, at the completion of our randomized trial, when we saw that the drug delivery mechanism was safe and effective, we decided to move out to secondary level centers to see if it could be provided in other places outside of a tertiary care center. And in this case, we conducted an open label trial in 2 sites, as I mentioned, in Nagpur. And in this case, almost all the women completed the full course of magnesium treatment successfully. No case received an excessive dose of magnesium, and no eclamptic seizures occurred after trial entry. And we actually did have 1 woman who was successfully transferred from the study site to GMC with the Springfusor pump in place. And we were, again, this is just anecdotal, but I mean, it's not a huge sample, but it's just to say that it does show the possibility of perhaps using the pump in transfer situations where you could start a dose somewhere and move that woman subsequently. And it was facilitated, I don't know if you noticed in the picture, but we developed a strap that could be used to hold the pump on a woman's arm so that she was not confined and could move around without jarring the pump in any way. So just in terms of our conclusions, we concluded from the study that the Springfusor offers a safe and effective alternative delivery mechanisms for the delivery of magnesium sulfate. The Springfusor significantly reduced the side effects associated with drug administration and was highly acceptable to women. The Springfusor could be a viable alternative for IV delivery in settings where electric infusion pumps are not available and could not be available due to cost. And the cost of the Springfusor, again, it's marketed by a company in Australia. It's currently marketed at, I think it's $8 for the pump. And the pump can be used multiple times. I think their failure tests say at least up to 300 times, but again, we haven't used it to the extent that we could. We didn't have a pump fail in the study, let's just say. So I don't know what the upper limit of that is in terms of number of uses per pump. We also learned some important lessons related to the introduction of the Springfusor. Okay, thanks. Okay. Yeah, I'm about finished, but we also learned a couple of important operations lessons. First of all, the need for IV insertion, and the training in IV insertion and maintenance should the Springfusor be introduced, especially into settings where providers aren't familiar with IV insertion. And the other issue that came up was sort of sorting, and I think this is just more in general in terms of training providers who are not familiar with use of magnesium, is being able to differentiate between the effects of the disease and the effects of the treatment, because in some cases providers were not able to distinguish those two things. And finally, the third thing was a need for a standardized protocol for delivery of magnesium sulfate, and that needed to be created in collaboration with anesthesiologists, because we often found that running an IV simultaneously or during the time of the cesarean section led to problems, and that anesthesiologists were often reluctant to accept patients who had started on MgSulf for their own reasons with regard to patient care.